I used to work the night shift at a small town gas station. It was a quiet job, mostly boring except for the occasional drunk customer or late night traveler. But there was one night that still haunts me. Around 3 a.m., a woman came in. She was older, maybe in her 60s, and looked disheveled, like she hadn't slept in days. She wandered the aisles aimlessly, whispering to herself. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it made me uneasy. After a few minutes, she came up to the counter, placing a single pack of gum down. As I rang it up, she leaned in close, her eyes wide and wild, and whispered, "They're coming for me. Don't let them take me." I was frozen, unsure of what to say. She grabbed the gum, still muttering under her breath, and left the store. I watched as she walked out into the darkness, disappearing into the night. I never saw her again. A week later, I heard on the news that a woman had been found dead in the woods behind the gas station. They said it looked like she'd been there for at least a few days, which would have placed her death around the same time she came into the store. I still wonder if it was the same woman, and if it was, what she had meant by, "They're coming for me." It was late one night when I was home alone, watching TV in my living room. My parents were out of town, so I was enjoying the rare solitude. Around midnight, I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the front porch. At first, I thought it might be a stray animal or the wind, but then I heard a soft knock on the door. I froze, the sound sending a chill down my spine. No one should have been there at that hour. I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. I hesitated for a moment, then turned the deadbolt to lock it, just to be safe. As I turned away, there was a loud bang on the door, followed by what sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the porch. My heart raced as I backed away, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to stay calm. They told me to stay inside and that they were on their way. The banging continued, growing more frantic, as if whoever was outside was desperate to get in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. When the police arrived, they found no sign of anyone, but they did find deep scratch marks on the door, as if someone, or something, had been trying to claw its way in. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the house made me jump, and I started sleeping with the lights on. I never found out who or what was on my porch that night, but I still stress out when I think about it. It was a hot summer night, and I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. My bedroom window was open, letting in a cool breeze, but it also brought with it the sounds of the night: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional distant dog barking. I was just starting to drift off when I heard something else, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I thought it was just a branch from the tree outside, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I sat up in bed and looked toward the window. In the dim light, I could just make out a face, pale and gaunt, staring in at me. My heart nearly stopped as I realized someone was watching me from outside. I was too terrified to move, hoping that whoever it was would go away. The face didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I finally found the courage to scramble out of bed and turn on the light, hoping to scare them off. But when I looked back at the window, the face was gone. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain shut, my hands trembling. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of who or what I had seen. The next morning, I checked outside the window, but there were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no disturbed bushes, nothing. For weeks after, I kept the curtains drawn and the windows locked at night, but the memory of that face still lingers in my mind. I never saw it again, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that faint tapping sound, and I wonder if it's waiting for another chance to get inside. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and I was home alone, enjoying a good book. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across my living room. The silence was comforting, and I was completely engrossed in my reading when there was a sudden knock at the door. Startled, I put the book down and went to answer it. When I opened the door, I found a man standing on my porch. He was tall, well-dressed, and had a friendly smile. He introduced himself as a representative from a local charity and asked if I had a moment to talk about donating to their cause. Something about him seemed off, though. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was an unnatural intensity in his gaze. I politely declined, but he persisted, saying it would only take a few minutes. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude, so I told him I wasn't interested and began to close the door. Before I could, he suddenly pushed against it, trying to force his way inside. My heart jumped into my throat as I used all my strength to shove the door closed and lock it. He banged on the door, yelling at me to let him in. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called the police. He continued pounding on the door, his voice growing more aggressive until I heard the sound of sirens approaching. That's when he stopped. I looked through the peephole and saw him walking away, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, they searched the neighborhood but didn't find him. They told me that there had been reports of similar incidents in the area, men posing as charity workers to gain access to homes. I was lucky to have reacted quickly, but every night I still feel uneasy when I think about it. I've been much more cautious about answering the door ever since. I grew up in a small, rural town where everyone knew each other, and life was usually peaceful. It was the kind of place where you could walk alone at night without a second thought. But one night, when I was 16, that sense of security was shattered in a way I've never been able to forget. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was walking home from a friend's house. I took the usual shortcut through a wooded area, a path I'd walked 100 times before. As I made my way through the trees, I noticed a figure standing just off the trail. At first, I thought it was a hunter, which wasn't uncommon around here, but something about him seemed off. He was wearing an orange hunting jacket, which stood out starkly in the moonlight, but his face was hidden in the shadows. I tried to keep my cool and nodded in his direction as I passed, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, his head slightly tilted as if he was studying me. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace, desperate to get out of the woods. As I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that he had stepped onto the path and was following me, his footsteps almost unnaturally silent. Panic set in, and I broke into a run. The sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot filled my ears, but I couldn't hear him anymore. When I finally dared to look back, the path behind me was empty. I stopped, trying to catch my breath, but the relief was short-lived. I could feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see him. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. He decided to go check it out, thinking it might just be someone messing around. When he returned, his face was pale. He told me there was no sign of anyone in the woods, but he did find something, a tattered orange jacket draped over a low-hanging branch, as if someone had left it there on purpose. We never spoke about it again, but from that day on, I avoided that path, especially at night. Every now and then, I still wonder who that man was and why he was there. But deep down, I'm not sure I want to know the answer. I had just moved into a new apartment in a quiet building. My neighbors seemed friendly enough, but there was one man who lived across the hall who gave me the creeps. He was always lurking around, watching me from his doorway whenever I came or went. He never said much, just a few words here and there, but his eyes always followed me, making me feel uneasy. One night, I came home late from work, and as I approached my door, I noticed his door was slightly ajar. I tried to ignore it and hurried to unlock my door, but just as I was about to step inside, I heard him call out to me. His voice was low and smooth, but there was something unsettling about the way he said my name. I turned to see him standing in his doorway, staring at me with a strange smile on his face. He asked if I needed any help, but his tone was anything but helpful. I declined politely and quickly went inside, locking the door behind me. As I stood there, trying to shake off the encounter, I heard a soft knock on my door. I froze. The knock was so quiet, almost like he was testing to see if I would respond. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, hoping he would go away. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped, but the feeling of unease lingered. I checked the peephole, and he was gone, but I knew he was still there, watching. Over the next few weeks, his behavior became more erratic. He would knock on my door at odd hours, leave strange notes under my door, and I even caught him standing outside my window one night. I reported him to the building manager, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually threatened me. Finally, one night, I heard a noise outside my apartment, a soft scraping sound, like someone was trying to pick the lock. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering that someone was trying to break in. The noise stopped just as the police arrived, and when they searched the hallway, they found him hiding in the stairwell with a set of lockpicks. He was arrested, but the whole ordeal left me shaken. I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could, but I still have nightmares about it. It's a reminder that you never really know who your neighbors are, or what they might be capable of. I've always loved hiking, and there's a trail not far from my house that I used to walk almost every weekend. It's a beautiful, secluded path through the woods, far enough from civilization that it feels like you're truly alone in nature. That's why I was so surprised when I ran into another hiker on one of my usual routes. I was about halfway through the trail when I saw him, a man probably in his late 40s with a scruffy beard and worn clothes. He was just standing there, in the middle of the trail, staring off into the trees. As I approached, I greeted him with a friendly, "Hello," but he didn't respond. He didn't even look at me. I tried to walk past him, but as I did, he turned his head ever so slightly, just enough for me to see his eyes. They were cold, empty, and fixated on something far away. I quickened my pace, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something off about him, something that made me feel uneasy, but I tried to shake it off as just my imagination. A few minutes later, I reached a fork in the trail and paused to catch my breath. I glanced back, and to my horror, the man was following me. He was still a ways back, but he was definitely walking in my direction. Panic set in, and I decided to take the shorter path back to the trailhead, hoping to lose him. I picked up the pace, almost jogging at this point, but every time I glanced back, he was still there, keeping the same distance behind me. I couldn't shake him. I started to run, my heart pounding in my chest, as the trail twisted and turned through the dense forest. When I finally reached the parking lot, I looked back one last time. He was gone. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down. I didn't see anyone else around, and the man had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. I never went back to that trail again, and to this day, I wonder what his intentions were. Was he just another hiker, or was there something more sinister about him? One night, I was out with some friends, enjoying a few drinks at a local bar. As the night wore on, I decided to call it early and head home. I ordered a rideshare, and within a few minutes, a car pulled up to the curb. The driver looked like the one in the app, and the license plate matched, so I got in without a second thought. We started driving, and everything seemed normal at first. The driver was quiet, not making small talk, which I appreciated. But after a few minutes, I noticed we weren't heading in the direction of my apartment. I checked the app, and it showed a completely different route. I asked the driver if we were going the right way, but he didn't respond. My stomach dropped as I realized something was very wrong. I asked again, more forcefully this time, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road. Panic set in, and I frantically texted my friend, sharing my location and telling her something was off. She immediately called me, but when I tried to answer, the driver snatched the phone from my hand and threw it into the back seat. I was trapped. My heart raced as I looked for an opportunity to escape, but we were speeding down a deserted highway with no exits in sight. I tried to stay calm, thinking of any way to get out of the situation. Finally, I spotted a gas station up ahead. I told the driver I needed to use the restroom, hoping he would stop. To my surprise, he pulled into the gas station. As soon as the car stopped, I threw open the door and bolted inside, yelling for help. The attendant behind the counter immediately called the police, and I locked myself in the restroom until they arrived. When they got there, the driver was gone, but they found my phone in the back seat. It turned out that the driver had hacked the app, altering the route to take me somewhere else entirely. I was lucky to have escaped, but the experience left me shaken. I never take rideshares alone anymore, and I always double-check the route before getting in the car. When I first moved into the city, finding a decent place to live was a challenge. I eventually found an ad for a cheap room in a shared apartment. The guy renting it out, Jason, seemed nice enough. Quiet, kept to himself, but friendly. The rent was reasonable, and the apartment was in a good neighborhood, so I moved in without hesitation. Things were fine for the first few weeks. Jason was almost never home, which was perfect for me since I liked having the place to myself. But then, one night, he came home acting strange. He was fidgety, barely made eye contact, and kept mumbling to himself. I asked if everything was okay, and he just nodded. disappearing into his room without another word. Over the next few days, his behavior grew more erratic. I would hear him pacing in his room late at night, talking to himself in a hushed, frantic tone. When I tried to check on him, he would snap at me, telling me to leave him alone. I started to feel uneasy, wondering if I had made a mistake moving in. Then, one night, I heard a loud crash coming from Jason's room. I rushed over, knocking on the door, but there was no answer. The door was locked, and I could hear what sounded like heavy breathing on the other side. I considered calling the police, but before I could, the noise stopped, and everything went silent. The next morning, Jason was gone. His room was empty. No clothes, no belongings, nothing. It was as if he had never lived there. I tried calling his phone, but it was disconnected. I even asked the landlord if he had heard from Jason, but he had no idea who I was talking about. According to him, I was the only tenant listed on the lease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to Jason, but there was no way to prove it. I eventually moved out, unable to stay in that apartment any longer. To this day, I still wonder what happened to him, and if he's out there somewhere, or if something far worse occurred behind the locked door of his room. I had just moved into my first apartment, a small but cozy one-bedroom in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. The building was old, with creaky floors and thin walls, but the rent was cheap, and the neighborhood was safe, or so I thought. One night, after a long day at work, I came home and went through my usual routine, dinner, a bit of TV, and then off to bed. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash coming from the living room. My heart raced as I tried to figure out what had happened. I listened closely, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was in my apartment. I silently reached for my phone, trying to call 911 without making any noise. As I dialed, the footsteps grew louder, closer. The intruder was making their way down the hallway toward my bedroom. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shaky, as I tried to stay calm. The operator answered, and I whispered that someone had broken into my apartment. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I could see the shadow of someone standing there through the crack under the door. I prayed they would leave, that they wouldn't try the door handle. But my worst fear came true when I heard the sound of the knob turning. Just as the door began to creak open, I heard sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too because they suddenly bolted, running back down the hallway and out the front door. I stayed hidden under my blankets until I heard the police arrive and announce themselves. The officers searched the apartment but found no sign of the intruder, only a broken window where they had entered. They told me I was lucky. They had likely been after quick cash or electronics and didn't expect anyone to be home. But the thought of what could have happened if the police hadn't arrived in time still creeps me out when I think about it. I moved out of that apartment the next month,